Hello everybody and welcome to Weekend Workshops presented by the Wichita Falls Museum of Art at MSU Texas. Today we're going to be going over some watercolor. Watercolor is a style of painting that's marked by building up an image with thin, transparent washes of color laid on top of each other and next to each other, and really allowing water to help influence what is going to happen with the paint. Today we're using a palette of watercolor, a couple of different cups of water, paper towel, some drawing implements, and a couple of different brushes. So let's talk about the paper real quick. Today I'm using 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is a little bit thicker and heavier compared to regular forms of paper because it's designed to help withstand the warping and twisting that happens when paper starts to get wet. To also help in this, you'll notice I've taped down the entire border of my piece of paper with about half of the tape on the paper, half of it off onto the backing board. You don't have to use a board. You could tape it right to a tabletop if you want, but sometimes I like using a board because I can still move it around and it makes drawing and painting a little easier at times. So let's talk about how to actually get paint onto the paper. I have two different cups of water in front of me. This cup is always going to be my wash cup, and this cup will always be full of nice, clear, clean water. I always get in the habit of going into my wash cup first, and then coming over to my clear water cup, and getting paint could be as easy as getting your brush wet, loading your brush with paint, and going directly onto the surface of your paper. This is probably the most direct way of applying paint, but sometimes it can be kind of boring, I think. Now, another reason why we have a wash cup and a clean water cup is because, say I wanted to use orange next. I don't want to just go right into orange using this dirty brush. I would get blue in that orange and it wouldn't be very nice to use in the future. So, I'm going to wash that out really, really well. Get some nice, clear, clean water, and then get some new paint. And then I'm free to apply the paint directly to the surface of my paper. Now, this isn't the only way of getting paint onto your paper. And this is also another reason why we keep a cup of clear water on hand. Because sometimes what can be really fun is just to paint an area on your paper with clear water. And once you have an area of clear water painted onto your paper, you can then go in and then introduce paint to that puddle in order to get these blooming effects. You'll notice the surface of this wet on wet technique is different than painting directly onto the surface of the paper. If you wish to retain that surface texture in your paint, you have to let this dry as it is. You can't mess with it. If you mess with it, that texture will disappear. So sometimes it can be nice to work on a different region of your paper while another area dries, and that way you don't worry about disturbing it or messing up a texture or accidentally having color go into it. Now, with this said, this can be a really interesting way to also mix color. So I'm painting in another area of just clear water, but I'm going to use a different color this time. Let's grab some pink. Okay? So we've just introduced more color into this corner. I want to see if I can add some more of that turquoise in with that pink, just to see what happens when they mix. So I'm going in with nice clean water. I'm going to take that turquoise and I'm also going to add it to that puddle. You can see it's starting to kind of mix on its own and we get some purpley tones. But if you wanted that mixing to be a little more thorough, just go in with a little bit more clear water and just start dabbing at it. and that will mix those colors more thoroughly on the surface while still retaining some interesting surface textures. Now, one thing to be careful about though, both of these areas are pretty wet still, and we really like what's going on with it. I think this is a pretty interesting area of color going on. I think this has some really interesting surface texture. But if you're not patient, and if you don't wait for these to dry, you can accidentally introduce color to them by painting too closely. Let me show you what that kind of looks like. So we're going to get some clear water. Let's do purple this time. So I'm on my paper, I'm painting, having a good time, and then all of a sudden I get too close. These colors will begin to run into each other. So it can be an effect, and you can really see this happening down here where this is just kind of drifting and melding. It can be a very interesting effect, and some people go for it. Just be wary of it in case you didn't want that kind of blooming to happen. Otherwise, you might end up with a situation like this, where I was trying to paint in a tree branch and it started to bloom into the background. Something I tried to avoid, and it happened, but I'm not too worried about it, but just be aware that it can happen. Now, once you have these different areas of color put on your piece of paper, there are some different things that you can do to the surface of the watercolor. You can experiment with things like adding grains of salt to it, and that will give kind of a speckly pattern. You can spray it with rubbing alcohol, and that will give a completely different texture as well. I've seen people take saran wrap and crumple it up and put it on top, and that gives kind of a geometric pattern on the inside of it. So if you're trying this at home, feel free to experiment with all of these different methods, because they can be a lot of fun. Now, while we were talking, this area in the corner has had a chance to dry. So we saw what happened when we introduced color from an already wet area with more paint. This area is dry, so let's see what happens when we put color on top over here. I'm going to take some of this green, and I'm just going to paint. And as you can see, those colors aren't mixing in the same way. If we wanted to, we could go with another wet technique where we go directly over the top with more water. And you can still see that outline underneath. The one thing you have to be careful about, though, is if you go in with regular water on top of watercolor, you see how I'm lifting that paint off the surface and almost erasing it? So just be careful. This can be one way of fixing mistakes, but make sure that you don't accidentally lift paint off of the paper by reactivating the paint that's already put down. Okay, so we've talked about how to get paint onto the actual paper, but I wanted to talk also about working off of drawings. And so you can use a regular pencil in order to sketch something out. Just be wary though, because watercolor is transparent, you will be able to see that drawing come through. Some people like to really embrace this and make it so that those underdrawings can really pop. Other people like to try and hide them and completely bury them. That's completely up to you. Like, I probably wouldn't draw very, very bold. I would go very, very light. Draw as lightly as you can if you want to try and hide it. Otherwise, it's just going to show through, and you're not going to be able to hide it. But with the lighter stuff, it disguises a little bit more easily. Okay? So, Watercolor is a very loose style of painting in general. It can be controlled, but in general it is a more loose style of painting. And so even if you're working from a drawing underneath and say the puddles of water that you're working with are starting to drift a little bit, what can you do in order to kind of control that? Well, let me get my other drawing. I started this the other day, painting of a cardinal, and you can see I have this drawing underneath. You can see those pencil lines coming through. I've begun to lay paint on the surface. I haven't been too worried about where that paint is drifting. I'm just kind of letting it do its own thing. And I did all of this using the wet on wet technique where I just painted in puddles of water and then filled it with color. So one thing you can do, you can always revisit different areas and lay more paint on top. If you wanted to, say like the beak of cardinals is red. If you wanted to reestablish that as a red area, you can always take a wet brush, paint that area, and then lay more red into the surface. Okay, already looking a little bit better. If you wanted to try and bring some of those details back to the forefront, you can always go in using a pen. I like trying to find pens that have waterproof ink because if I make a drawing using one of these pens and then you place water on top of it or you want to paint some more, it's not going to make the pen ink run and spread and smear. And so, you know, do some experiments. Figure out which pens might work for you, which ones may or may not. But just using a pen, you can go right in and reestablish those outlines to really make them come to the forefront. And so even just that little bit of outlining really did a lot to pull things forward and reestablish that shape, even though the initial painting was a little loose and a little rough, and maybe those lines didn't fill in quite the way that we wanted to. So consider multimedia methods of also working with your watercolor. One other thing that I like doing as well is I like introducing highlights using something like a gel, like a white gel pen. And in this way we can go in and just by adding the tiniest bit of white, you can really make some details pop. So these, by all means, are not all of the methods associated with watercolor painting. We just wanted to give you a few simple ones that you could do at home in order to get you going and diving right into watercolor. We hope that these techniques are helpful to you, and we hope that they inspire you to get out there and I mean in your home, and just start making art, you know, start creating and really try to share a part of you through your work. Thank you for watching our video. We appreciate you, and we hope that you have an excellent day. So until next time, we wish you the best.